Mining and commodities giant Glencore will pay more than $1.1 billion after it pleaded guilty to a web of bribery and price manipulation charges. The company admitted to bribing officials in several countries to manipulate prices. Now, for more on this, we are joined by political economist Professor Patrick Bond. Good to have you, Professor Bond. Thanks very much for talking to us.
Oh, it's nice to be with you, Leanne, and the viewers. Thanks.
So I suppose let's just start off by getting your thoughts on the settlement deal of over $1 billion with Glencore after the company basically agreed to plead guilty in two separate criminal cases.
I mean, it required the departure last year of Ivan Glassenberg. So he'd be probably, the guy at the top. The buck stops there. Two of his senior executives in coal and copper and oil trading were implicated. And I think the dilemma is, okay, he's retired, the company's paid a fine, but is this the sort of punishment required to halt the looting of the continent of Africa, especially? That's where most of the bribery took place, and to compensate the victims. And unfortunately, because this is in the United States, what they do typically, they keep the money themselves. They give a little to the Brits and the Brazilians also involved in prosecution. But really, this is one of those victim crimes where reparations are due. And I think the reparations in a broader sense, not just the bribery, but for unequal ecological exchange. So Glencore, the biggest commodity trading company in the world, really systematically removed the wealth of Africa. And as we see the wealth going down, the GDP might go up. There's a commodity super cycle. So they make the case they're doing good. But now we know all the sleaze involved, and the net wealth depletion really does require, I think, winding down a company that was so egregious, the way we saw Bell Pottinger, Cash Paymaster Services, Sahara Computers, other kind of criminal companies had to be wound down. And that's probably what I think activists in the mining sector, very, very active protesters and community and labor, that's probably what they'll be advocating.
Yeah, and this is the reality. I mean, when we look at $1 billion, a settlement deal of $1 billion for a company of this magnitude and this size, and for the corruption that has run exceptionally deep, and we haven't even touched on what's been happening here in South Africa, which we'll get to in a short while. I mean, in your opinion, is this enough, or does it actually sound like a reward for their corruption?
Well, and to reflect that, the stock market price actually rose 6% last week as the deal was being announced, because I think the rest of the financial community had expected a harsher penalty, given how Ivan Glassenberg really ran that company. Now, don't forget, this is a company that began its life as Mark Rich and Company, which was the oil sanctions busting company that helped keep apartheid lubricated for a couple of decades, from the 70s, before democracy. And I think it's at that level where if you're born a crime, and someone like Ivan Glassenberg, educated here, born here, went to high school at Hyde Park, some very bad habits in that period. You could add people like Elon Musk, who also grew up in that milieu and then advocates coups against Bolivia to get lithium. So I think it's a good chance to look not only at why this company should be really penalized much more for this behavior, but also the general corporate milieu we have in South Africa. Because in Johannesburg, in Sandton and Midrand, in Umhlanga, in Durban, in Stellenbosch, in Central Cape Town, we have 5 nodes of corporate criminality that PwC has rated during the 2010s as actually the worst in the world in their biannual economic crime and fraud survey. So it's a good chance to look in the mirror, and also, frankly, to look at President Ramaphosa, because he was the main partner of Glencore and chaired its Optimum mine just before becoming the deputy president in 2014.
Yeah, we certainly can't ignore that. And I mean, that's something that I would like to just talk about for a little bit. I mean, Glencore was mentioned in state capture. Glencore itself didn't deny the allegations made at the state capture inquiry that it aimed to use Cyril Ramaphosa to extract money from Eskom. So where is South Africa in this entire saga? Because what we're experiencing on a daily basis in terms of load shedding and the state of Eskom and everything linked to that, very much so at the core, we can go all the way back to the days of Glencore, and we could start there. I mean, this is a good starting point, but let's go to state capture. Where did Glencore fit into all of this?
If I can just say for a second, Leanne, that I would go a bit further back to where Medupi coal-fired power plant was basically constructed by Hitachi, the core part of it, the boilers. But Hitachi had given 25% of its ownership to the ANC's investment wing, Chancellor House. And to me, that's where, in a sense, Eskom really starts to become a state capture victim. I don't know why Zondo gave that a pass, because again, the US did prosecute it under their Foreign Corrupt Practices Act in 2015. Hitachi paid a 300 million rand fine, but it was to the US government. We, the suffering Eskom customers or the taxpayers, didn't get anything from that. It's another good signal that we have to change the system and do local prosecutions and not, leave it to the Yankees, because they're just going to grab the money for themselves. So coming back now to, the Eskom problem is magnified by the people making the allegations. Yesterday it was Machele Koko, who was the former head during some of the state capture, and Brian Molefe has made these allegations, which is why Zondo picked them up when Molefe testified. But these aren't very credible witnesses. There's talk that they'll be the next set of arrestees after Sibonga Gama and the Transnet group a few days ago. So I'm not sure that we're going to rely upon tainted witnesses in this, the two former Eskom heads. However, we do have enough information that President Ramaphosa, when he was a deputy president in 2014, ran the Eskom war room and then did give the Optimum mine, which is a very important part of the coal supply to Eskom, very high increases. Now, he had been the chair of that mine, and Glencore still ran it until it was sort of shaken down by the former mining minister Zwane and the Gupta brothers in Switzerland, but that was late 2015. So there's this sort of difficult period for President Ramaphosa to explain. Now, Shanduka, his company, was the minority Black Economic Empowerment partner. And the dilemma for President Ramaphosa is that he actually only fully divested from Shanduka in 2016 to Putuma Nhleko, who was his main business partner. Now, these dates are important because when he was the head of the Eskom war room, the allegation from both Koko and Molefe is that he was in conflict of interest by giving Optimum that huge increase in the coal price. I think these, they pale in comparison to the biggest damage, which is the climate damage, and that, unfortunately, the state capture has kept South Africa addicted to coal, whether it's Hitachi or Glencore and Shanduka. These companies are very powerful, they're very influential, as we've seen. And that means we've been addicted to a form of energy which is going to cause climate sanctions to come in starting next year with the European Union carbon border adjustment mechanism. So the damage is quite intense and will reflect on anyone doing any exporting using Eskom energy in future years as the EU and the other Western trading partners clamp down.
Yeah, I want to go back a little bit to two key characters here, as you mentioned, Brian Molefe and Machele Koko. So these developments obviously have now come to light, and we see that Machele Koko has been speaking out and a lot. I mean, they have not held back at all. I mean, they have stuck to their story the entire time, basically saying that that Cyril Ramaphosa, our president, knew all about what was going on. And in fact, Koko going further, and I'm just reading an article, and what he was saying during an interview, this was, I think, yesterday or the day before, saying that he has now been vindicated by the US justice system, as they were not afraid to investigate Glencore and find evidence of corruption against this company. So again, bringing into light the Zondo Commission now. And the Zondo Commission, you yourself just said, kind of shrugging off these things. Does that not put an entire question mark on the Commission now? I mean, if we are seeing the guilt of Glencore coming at such a high level, how could this just be shrugged off?
Well, that plus the Medupi, the single biggest act of corruption, right? Hitachi basically bribing the ANC, according to the United States, which won that settlement from Hitachi. So Zondo 2.0, well overdue, because we're talking about a crime that we're all living with in terms of Medupi's costs and overruns and blowing up. And also Kusile was a Hitachi boiler victim as well. And these plants aren't working, and they are causing massive emissions, about 35 million tons a year if they're working well. That's huge, right? That's coming up to about 8% each of our national emissions, which we have to dramatically cut. Now, these are the kinds of things that if Zondo had a sort of bigger scope, could bring in things like climate crimes. There's talk of ecocide and international climate court. these are the sorts of things that, the nexus of corruption and really bad policy, coal-centric policy. This is in the 2010s when everyone knew, really from the 1990s, that they'd have to stop the coal addiction. Can you believe Molefe and Coco? I mean, their interests are obviously to distract attention, to tell the society it's not our fault that Eskom is performing so badly. It's not our fault that not just load shedding, but load reduction is being applied by the current leader, Andre de Ruyter. Some call that energy racism. So what they're trying to do is obviously, distract the attention of the society, but I don't think they're incorrect in pointing out these flaws, especially when it came to the Eskom war room in late 2014, when President Ramaphosa, as deputy president, then was allegedly in conflict of interest because of the Shanduka link to Optimum. Now, Shanduka has had a bad history in coal, water license failures, all sorts of allegations of local communities that were disrupted in Mpumalanga. And I hope President Ramaphosa is taking a very sober look at his own legacy, his own climate debt, in a sense, to those like the Durban rain bomb victims. 500 people died just last month, and that was because of the climate crisis. And it's a time for a shakeup of our consciousness, isn't it? And, to that extent, if Glencore's coal, but of course also all the other minerals it deals with in places like the DRC. It was in league with an Israeli tycoon called Dan Gertley. That was one of the core problems in the DRC. And we look at the African continent, we look at refugees from the DRC in South Africa, and I think we can begin to connect the dots and say, well, they're really being looted by multinational capital. Yeah. And it's really time to reverse that. So even though it's a small, intervention, the 20 billion rand is a trivial amount of what damage Glencore's done, really. And South Africa, our regulators, DTI, Treasury, Reserve Bank are all, I think, implicated in nudge, nudge, wink, wink. They just not really keeping an eye on illicit financial flows and all the other ways that our society is looted in the extractive industries.
Yeah.
It's a good time for a wake-up call, isn't it?
I mean, my question to you as well, and I keep bringing up the president's involvement in all of this, because we can't ignore this, and we can't. I mean, we saw the president basically taking to the stand and saying that he had no idea, that he didn't know that this was happening. The then CEO at the time of Glencore, when the president was the chairperson of the holding company, had said that no, a shareholder has absolutely nothing to do with this, and it could not possibly have involved him. But how is that possible? How can we plead ignorance to something like this?
It's not really a viable argument. I didn't know, right? Because President Ramaphosa's other companies, let's look at Lonmin. I mean, they took out billions of rands to Bermuda under, again, illicit financial flows. There were two people in the office there doing marketing when the workers were demanding a living wage, and instead they got bullets. We could look at the MTN company, which President Ramaphosa chaired for a good long time. I think it was from 2007 to 14, and it was under those, chair, and then his CEO was Inhleko, Putuma Inhleko, and they were guilty, as many have charged, of illicit financial flows, but also in Iran, in Afghanistan, of all kinds of illegal activities. You could look at his role in Standard Bank, a bank that not only is a major fossil fuel financier this whole time, but also was doing illicit currency manipulation. And I just, hope President Ramaphosa looks in the mirror and says, well, this period in my life where I accumulated the estimated 6 billion rand, some of that really should be returned to the victims. And we should shake up South African corporates, because this is the milieu in which the likes of Ivan Glassenberg or President Ramaphosa himself in all of these unfortunate activities. This is a milieu that creates them. It's not simply this, Steinhoff and Stellenbosch or Tongaat Hewlett in Durban, or all of these accounting companies we rely on, KPMG, PwC, Deloitte, who are all implicated in all aspects of these state capture, sort of nudge, nudge, wink, wink. I think in Sandton, Midrand, Umhlanga, Stellenbosch, and Central Cape Town, this kind of, let's say, new focus on corporate corruption in our society, when, the Transparency International rankings put our government only 110th most corrupt, and we're looking at our corporates at number 1 or this year number 2, tied with China behind India, and the PwC rankings. We really have to do something quite dramatic to change that power balance that allows them to continue to capture the state.
Yeah, we certainly do. And I mean, again, further reading, a little bit of reaction to, the Glencore finding. The reality is, I mean, you get a guy like Themba Godi who's basically saying that, this entire ruling and the developments overseas have been, again, and I've mentioned this before, put a massive question mark on the entire Zondo Commission, basically saying that this was set up just to nail certain political leaders, and others would walk away free. And, one wonders, and one has to ask that question, now that we see something like this coming through, is that in fact the case? And can we look at it seriously? But I want to just get
I just say, I wouldn't go quite so far as to say there's bias in Zondo's. I think his staff, they did a good job at the level of digging. They were assisted by 35,000, hijacked emails that were released to show what the Guptas were up to. But it really does, I think, imply that our work on corporate responsibility, and today is the annual general meeting of Standard Bank. There are going to be protests outside because of corporate malfeasance against the public interest, and we just need, I think, a great deal more official attention, scholarly and journalistic attention, and activist attention. I think this is the clear signal. So Zondo 2.0, overdue. Let's see if we can advocate to make something like that happen.
I don't know if we've got the money to advocate to make something happen. It already cost us billions to look into this one. But I want to ask you, in terms of what, again, the calls are coming in, particularly from, just one press release coming out from the EFF, basically now saying that they're calling on SARS to investigate all of Glencore's transactions from 2007 to date and basically use their power to follow every single cent. They've also asked for the MPA to get involved, the Hawks to get involved. I mean, do you think, which one would hope that the South African law and government will now look closely into this?
Yes, I certainly hope so. I know our own government has been a little bit too, sensitive to do politically difficult cases, and Glencore and its relationship to Shanduka would be one. However, we do have cases where, such as Bill Pottinger, where a variety of groups and wealthy customers just said, shut it down, corporate death sentence. We saw that with Black Sash fighting against the company that was basically taking the monthly grants, giving 6-year-old girls microfinance contracts. Cash Paymaster Services, a World Bank owned, 22% owned company, and it had to be, shut down and executed as well. Sahara, these are sorts of experiences where, South Africa, going back to movements for sanctions against companies profiting from apartheid, has really been at the cutting edge in world terms in demanding a public interest. So time to ratchet that up once again.
All right, we've got to leave it there. Thank you. Thanks so much for talking to us. Political economist Professor Patrick Bond talking to us about what's happening with the whole issue and the findings with Glencore and how that, of course, relates to South Africa with regard to state capture and the likes of those that have been involved and benefited from that. And will we ever see reparations here back at home? Not sure if we could hear from what the professor was saying.